Blood at the Clock Tower. How Amin's public executions tried to crush rebellion. On the stormy afternoon of September 9, 1977, the heart of Kampala bore witness to a horror that would etch itself forever into Uganda's collective memory. At the clock tower grounds along Entebbe Road, 12 men, businessmen, teachers, former government officials, stood tied to poles, blindfolded, and facing a brutal end. Their crime, according to President Idi Amin's military tribunal, was plotting to overthrow the government. Their punishment was death by firing squad, public, merciless, and intended to terrify a nation into submission. The story of how Uganda descended into this theatre of public killings begins not just with the events of 1977, but years earlier, in 1973 in the eastern town of Mbale, where Captain Tom Masaba met a similar fate. His execution marked one of the first in a series of highly publicized killings under Amin's rule, aimed at breaking the backbone of any opposition. Seeds of fear. In 1973, Mbale Masaba had once served the Uganda army faithfully, but by 1973, amid rising paranoia in Amin's inner circle, loyalty counted for little. Masaba was accused, perhaps justly, perhaps not, of conspiring against Amin's government. In Mbale town, in full view of the gathered crowd, he was executed by firing squad. The message was clear: dissent, real or imagined, would be repaid in blood. That execution was among the first public spectacles Amin orchestrated to suppress dissent. It set a pattern: accusation, swift military tribunal, and public execution, all carefully choreographed to instill terror in the population. Despite appeals from both local religious leaders and international figures urging Amin to curb the bloodshed, the killings only escalated. To Amin, public executions were more than punishment. They were performances, psychological warfare designed to paralyze opposition before it could organize. The road to 1977. Tension builds between 1973 and in 1977 Amin's regime grew more unpredictable and brutal. Economic mismanagement, political repression, and a growing list of disappeared individuals made daily life precarious. Uganda, once a shining star of East Africa, slid into fear and suspicion. During this time, Amin's distrust of his own officers, politicians, and civil servants deepened. Any hint of disloyalty, even mere association with former President Milton Obote's supporters, could bring deadly consequences. Prisons overflowed. Torture chambers at places like Makindye Barracks and the State Research Bureau became infamous. Yet even this invisible terror was not enough. Amin needed highly visible acts of dominance to maintain control. Thus came the decision to publicly execute 12 men accused of treason in 1977 at the very heart of the capital. The 12 who they were. The men dragged to the clock tower that fateful Friday were not random individuals. They represented Uganda's intellectual and administrative elite: prison officers, police commissioners, teachers, businessmen, and civil servants. John Kabandizi, former senior superintendent of prisons. E.N. Mutabazi, former superintendent of prisons. Peter Atua, former principal officer at Murchison Bay Prison. Daniel Nsereko, former Assistant Commissioner of Police. T. Ben Ogwang, former Military Intelligence Officer. Y.Y. Okot, former Chief Inspector of Schools. John Leji Olobo, former Senior Industrial Relations Officer. Elias Okidi Menya, former General Manager, Lake Victoria Bottling Company. Abdallah Anyuru, former Chairman of the Public Service Commission. Ben Ongom, businessman. Julius Peter Adupa, former teacher at Lira Polytechnic. Garrison S. Anono, former principal of Bobby Foundation School. These were men who had held positions of influence and authority. By executing them, Amin was sending a chilling message. No one, regardless of past service or prestige, was safe. Holy month, bloody day, the timing of the execution was as shocking as the act itself. The last Friday of Ramadan, a sacred day of prayer and reflection for Muslims worldwide, became a day of bloodshed. This provoked outrage among Muslim leaders across Africa. Presidents William Tolbert of Liberia and Omar Bongo of Gabon, along with several influential black Muslim leaders, reportedly urged Amin to delay or cancel the executions out of respect for the holy period. However, Amin ignored their appeals. Some speculated that Amin's brief disappearance from public view days before the executions was tied to international pressure or even fears for his own safety. But ultimately, the president emerged and authorized the killings personally. His signature, along with that of Lieutenant Col Juma Ali, chair of the tribunal, director of public prosecutions Francis Ayume, and military police head Major Farouk Habib, sealed the fate of the 12. Let our blood flow. On the morning of September 9th, the prisoners were loaded into prison vans under heavy guard. As they approached the clock tower, witnesses reported hearing them chant defiantly, "Let us die for what we don't know, for what we have not done. Let our blood flow." Rain began to fall, a torrential, almost biblical downpour. Robeson Benazu. Otim Engur, in his book Survival, A Soldier's Story, recalls being in nearby Kisenyi slum, drinking malwa when the sky darkened without warning. The rain was so heavy that the whole city flooded, Engur wrote. That rain was so bizarre that we all concluded that it was God expressing annoyance and displeasure about the impending firing squad. Even nature seemed to mourn. At the execution grounds, the men were hooded and tied to metal poles. Only the government's official photographer was allowed to document the scene. No journalist, no civilian dared to take a photograph, not under the watchful eyes of the armed guards. When the shots rang out, residents as far away as Katwe and in Zambia could hear them. The clock tower ground, once a symbol of Kampala's growth and ambition, was now a place of blood and death. Aftermath, silence, and terror in. The immediate aftermath, Kampala fell silent. Businesses shuttered early, streets emptied, the citizens of Uganda retreated into their homes, gripped by fear that anyone, a neighbor, a colleague, even a friend, could be accused next. International condemnation was swift. Newspapers such as the Washington Post and the Fort Scott Tribune reported the executions with horror, but within Uganda, radio stations and newspapers, heavily censored by Amin's regime, barely mentioned the incident. It was as though the nation was being forced to erase the memory even as it was happening. Amin, meanwhile, portrayed the executions as acts of national defense. He claimed they were necessary to preserve the purity of the revolution he had launched in 1971 when he seized power from Obote. A legacy of fear, the public executions of 1977, following earlier killings like that of Captain Masaba, solidified Amin's reputation as one of Africa's most brutal dictators. His use of public violence created a legacy of fear that lasted long after his overthrow in 1979. Some Ugandans who lived through that era still refuse to walk near the old clock tower grounds, claiming the area is haunted by the spirits of the slain. Others speak of a generational trauma, a lingering dread passed down to children and grandchildren. Even decades later, the brutal tactics Amin employed, public humiliation, arbitrary justice, and spectacle killings, serve as grim reminders of how power, unchecked and unchallenged, can destroy a nation's soul. Conclusion: The blood still stains Idi Amin's reign, left Uganda battered and traumatized. The public executions, especially those staged at the clock tower and earlier in towns like Mbale and Kampala, were not just acts of punishment, they were calculated psychological assaults on the entire country. Today the clock tower is gone, replaced by a traffic junction as Kampala modernizes. But for those who know the history, the ground beneath the asphalt is still soaked in memory, a memory of blood, rain, and the defiant chants of men who died, proclaiming their innocence. They are not forgotten, and neither is the terror that sought to silence them.